Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Welcome to the live webinar on Public-Private Partnerships Practice and Implementation by Dr. William P. Kittredge. This webinar is arranged by Madinah Institute for Leadership and Entrepreneurship, MILE. I'm Ali Jafri representing MILE and will be moderating this webinar this evening. Just a quick introductory words on Dr. Kittredge. Dr. Kittredge is a senior level professional specializing in strategic economic development planning and significant private sector entrepreneurial and executive experience. His goal is focused with executive level communication skills, showcasing strengths in proposal writing and coalition building. Dr. Kittredge is the global president of Servlet Management and Strategy Consultants, where he looks after all four heads of the organization in USA, Thailand, and Pakistan. Having worked with prestigious organizations such as Carnegie Mellon University of Georgia and the Economic Development Administration EDA at the U.S. Department of Commerce, to name a few, he has demonstrated his ability to collaborate with senior management and key stakeholders in analyzing and developing policy, leading organizational change, and obtaining results. This vast experience makes him an expert at qualitative and quantitative skills in supporting program and performance assessment expertise. This presentation will be for about 40 to 45 minutes, and the remaining 25 minutes will be for the Q&A. So we request the audience to please hold your thoughts and questions till Dr. Kittredge finishes his presentations. With that, I'm going to go ahead and make him the presenter. For that, you just have to bear with me for a few seconds. Let me give him the presentation rights. I have just sent you a request. Dr. Kittredge, I've just sent you a request, sir, allowing to share your screen.
Okay,
If you accept.
okay, I think we're on. Can everyone see the screen and the slides and everything?
If you've accepted it, it will just give, I think it's taking about 3 to 4 seconds delay.
Okay. Yeah,
it's rather taking
a. Okay, I see. It's loading it. I see it now.
Yeah, it's it. Okay, great.
Okay, so the audience can see the slides in 9%, I guess. Okay.
Yes, sir.
All right. So, Are they visible now?
Yeah,
Slides
it is
visible now.
It's
we're
seeing your desktop now.
Oh, there they are. Oh, we're seeing the desktop. That's not what we want to see. All right. I apologize for that. Let's see if I can. Here we go. And all right. Public-private partnerships, as we said in the brochure advertising this, I'm going to assume some knowledge of public-private partnerships and also, by implication, some interest in them on your part. It makes very little sense to be doing something like this from scratch, especially in the rather short time frame that we have. I think that what we'll talk about today will interest you, and there are details which, again, our time constraints may not permit us to get into. However, supplemental materials, including all of the materials that I will use as reference as I go through the talk, and the source materials are available. I think that between Mile and myself, we can get them into a Dropbox for you or some other method to get them to you. I have been engaged in public-private partnerships quite extensively all over the world, and what we see is a trend toward more and more of these as governments start to realize that corporations, large and small, can make significant contributions in expertise, in financing, and in flexibility that governments may lack. Many of the examples that I will use today or tonight are from India. A lot of that is because the Indian government has made a major commitment to public-private partnerships. However, the lessons that we'll talk about are extensible throughout the context. So just to sort of set our agenda, I'm going to talk a little bit about the economic context. Where does this come from? Why might we do it? What they are, what these partnerships are sort of generally. Talk about some of the critiques that have come up, not the political critiques, but the economically based critiques, and some cautionary lessons. Talk about something that often is not covered, and that's contract renegotiation. One of the challenges, as I'll talk about more in depth, is renegotiation. It's not, however, something that comes up a lot. I have some case examples that we'll go through to talk about that. People often ask, why are public goods different, and how does the public-private partnership work in this case? And private goods and services like a can of Coke or an automobile are things which are said to be rival, i.e. my use of them precludes your use, and they're excludable. We do not have social or other conventions which prevent me from excluding you should you not choose to pay the price. So if you don't want to buy a can of Coca-Cola, you don't get to drink it. Public goods and services are sort of at the other end of that spectrum. They are things like a lighthouse. Once I put up the lighthouse, I can't exclude you from using it. Your ships know where they are, and they have characteristics that they're non-rival. If you're using the lighthouse, I'm using the lighthouse, it doesn't matter. But because of those things, because they're not rival and excludable, the private sector generally does not engage in the production of them because you can't make any money. If you can't keep me from using your lighthouse, then you cannot stop me from using it. You cannot charge me. However, we have found over the years, especially in recent years, growing in, say, the last decade or decade and a half, a great need for private sector expertise in the production of public goods and services. So we see privatization, we see different ways that this is happening. What we'll be talking about are public-private partnerships, which take on a slightly different permutation. One of the rationales is that externalities can't be dealt with. In the private sector, if the externalities are such that you don't have a benefit directly to your company, then things like water pollution, etc., actually call for government intervention because the scope of the externality is beyond the business generally, and may even be beyond the business, the scope of the local government. So usually thought of as negative externalities are cost justifying government intervention, but they're also positive externalities. You might be a private beekeeper, all you're after is the honey, but my apple orchard next door benefits from it. Issues of equity come in the public sector that are often not, strictly speaking, in the private sector, generally speaking. And equity is simply a question of why we do something when we might not otherwise do it from a strictly business perspective. So, public education is the example I use, but there are many others. So these two considerations, consideration of externalities and consideration of equity, are new components as you start to work with the private sector that you probably haven't dealt with a great deal in the private sector. So there are things that are going to change the environment. So the public-private environment is going to be influenced by those where your strictly private sector dealings may not be, generally are not. The third issue is efficiency. Efficiency in a business is I can make things for less. I can make the same quality or better quality for less. It is very simple. It's very straightforward. However, because in part of equity concerns which come in the public sector that are not as important in the private sector, not as much of a concern in the private sector, efficiency in the public sector really has both the productive efficiency we think of in the private sector, but it also has this allocative efficiency aspect where the question of who gets these things and why becomes important. So healthcare might be a good example, where most societies say, regardless of how much money you have, regardless of the productive efficiency involved, we think you ought to be able to have healthcare. And this public welfare, as opposed to private welfare, increased wealth, increased stock in the private sector, is something that then comes into play. So those three things are different and color, if you will, the public-private partnership environment. Public-private partnerships can be set up for different reasons. The government can actually service a public demand by hiring public workers, purchasing equipment, and say, for instance, building a road itself or establishing a program, or, as in public-private partnerships or other procurement activities, the government agency may provide the same service by partnering or contracting with a private entity. Right? That can be an individual, a technical expert, an attorney, an accountant, a surveyor, someone like that. A for-profit corporation is primarily what we'll talk about here, but there are also times when social businesses and nonprofits come in. If you care to look for where public-private partnerships sort of fit in, some people think of them as privatization. I tend not to agree with that. Those tend to be more regulated, privately owned utilities and those kinds of things that are owned by the private sector in perpetuity. Conventional procurement is the other end of the scale, if you will, where the public entity comes to you and says, I want to buy trucks, or I want to buy paper, or I want to buy accounting services, and they provide it, they procure it, they buy it from you just like any other company does. In the middle, in this new growing area, is where we find public-private partnerships, and we find a number of different kinds. I've listed a few here. I'll go into them in more detail in just a moment. But my point being is that public-private partnerships are a type of procurement from a government's perspective, and so they are often subject to many of the same procurement rules which governments may have. And that is an important thing to remember when you are looking at these opportunities in terms of your company's ability to deal with some of these other issues. Again, the issues of efficiency as they are interpreted in the public sector, the issues of equity as they're interpreted in the public sector, and the kinds of things that you'll run into when you look at working with the public sector in this kind of partnership. Because understand that unlike conventional procurement, where they come to you and they say, I want to buy this product or service from you just like everybody else buys it, and unlike full privatization, where you, as a private sector entity, completely own the entire facility or entity, in a public-private partnership, you are literally in partnership on a long-term basis with the government. A procurement, once you've sold the goods to the government or any other entity, you're done. In full privatization, you always have total ownership. Right? You may be regulated, but you have total ownership. In public-private partnerships, you are in a long-term relationship with the government as a partner, and that changes things significantly. So public-private partnership then refers to these long-term agreements between the government and the private sector with some clear agreements on shared objectives, with clearly in mind some of these things that if you do not work with government commonly may not be familiar to you. These equity concerns I mentioned and the like. These are long-term shared objectives to deliver public goods. infrastructure or public services. You might contract, you might have ambulance service. It's not the same as privatization. It's an approach that public authorities adopt to increase often private sector involvement in the delivery of the public services. Why are they doing this? They're doing this so they can achieve reduced costs, they can access your expertise, and they can increase total investment in the private sector. Okay, so again, there's a long-term relationship. If they're asking you to increase total investment, they are looking for private capital to supplement public capital. They may be looking to reduce costs for any number of reasons and any number of methods, and they may be after your expertise. If you have specific expertise in highways, power generation, etc., they may want to access that on an ongoing basis. Main features of these things, as I've said, they're long-term. 10 to 60 years is the range. You are working, you will work on an ongoing basis. Your representatives and the government representatives will spend a great deal of time together. These enduring relationships create opportunities, and they may create problems where the public and private sector have not worked out all of the relative roles, right, and shared responsibilities, right? As I said before, this is a method of procurement. One of the big issues is risk transfer. And the reason I say it's somewhat problematic is that the question of risk, if, for instance, you build a toll road and the traffic projections are woefully wrong, as we'll see an example of that, who bears that risk? If this is something that is owned by the private sector, then it's clear you bear that risk. If it's something that's owned by the public sector and all you did was procurement where you were contracted to build the road and you built the road, then it's clear. When you're in a public-private partnership, you're in new ground. And the fact of the matter is that over a 10 to 60-year term, you are unlikely in the extreme, I don't care how good your attorneys are, you're unlikely in the extreme to anticipate all the changes that will take place during that time. So those things need to be brought into consideration. And then the final thing is this flexible ownership. There are a myriad of different options, and we'll talk about some of them, but really the issue is limited only by the creativity of the partners. Okay. So some of the elements, some of the way you can do this, design and build. Usually integrated with one of the other elements, but this is a partnership where you design and build, say, a road, or you might get a contract if you're in social services and say, we want you to deliver hospital services, or we want you to deliver something else that they then ask you on a long-term basis to provide. Design build tends to be the shorter end of that, where the design-build contracts tend to be shorter if that's all they are. However, what the trend is that they're becoming longer term where the design and build elements are integrated with others such as operation and maintenance. So you then, for instance, let's say you're asked to build a hospital, they then ask you to operate and maintain it, not provide in the general case, the medical services, that might be provided by the state, but they would be in a hospital that you own and operate. The maintenance, who pays the electric bill, how you get the place cleaned, those kinds of things, how the building is repaired, etc., are operated by the private sector. Again, leveraging your expertise. Finance. The number of different financing methods and mixes that I have seen defies even my imagination. There is almost every possible permutation that you can think of, and many that until I saw them I never thought of. But It is some combination of public and private funds. Typically, it is blended with the risk management calculations. So the private sector can raise capital funding for a project through equity, stock sale, etc., or debt finance, or both. Can be recovered through user charges, the sale of the service to the public sector, or a combination of the two, where you have a blended operation that does both. And the finance aspects tend to be some of the trickier ones, because public money coming in to the partnership often has conditions that are not typical in the private sector. So it's another one of the sort of things you get a hold of. Ownership, when entering into a public-private partnership, a public authority must decide whether the government or the private company should own the facility that's developed. So you could design and build a hospital, and now it becomes government property. Obviously, there would be some profit in that, but they might still ask you to do the maintenance, both the operational maintenance, keeping it clean, etc., and the capital maintenance, making sure the ceilings don't leak, the roof doesn't leak. But that is different, and the private company might own the facility. In some arrangements, the land will be owned, but the facility is owned by the private sector because land can't be transferred in some cases. And in many, if not all, the ownership eventually reverts to the public sector after some period of time. Sometimes as soon as construction is completed, other times it may be 20, 30, 40 years down the road. So just sort of summarizing some of those differences, in a traditional procurement, you might, and this is a construction example I got from PricewaterhouseCoopers, you might have a capital cost and those cost payments, and typically in large construction projects, for those of you not familiar with them, you make progress payments, right? You receive progress payments. So at some point, you are owed $10 million because you have reached a certain, you may have so many miles of road completed, or you may have the road bed laid out, or whatever. And then there may be cost overruns, which are subject to change orders. For instance, you decide we're going to trench through here to put in a water line, and you think it's all sand, and it turns out there's rock there. You'd have a cost overrun, right? But that money is coming in during the phase of constructions, right? So your construction going on over time, you have time overruns, etc., that you are being paid for as you go along. However, in the public-private partnership, you generally get no payments until facilities are ready. So if you are building a road, you generally get no payments until you open it and the first cars start using it. Right? And those payments are based generally on availability, on usage. So whether it's a hospital building or a service, if you're providing an ambulance service, you may lay out the routes and do all the scheduling and buy the vehicles, etc., but you don't actually start to get paid until you have operational phase. Now, during this, in this case, I've got a first 5 years, you may be doing the construction, but you're financing it out of the private sector finance that you've gotten. Now, you may be leveraging, and typically this is how it's done, you may be leveraging the contract that you have with the government, where you will be getting these usage and availability payments. So you may be going to the debt markets with this contract in hand. The government has agreed to make these payments and these amounts once we're operational. And so what you're getting there are bridging loans, construction loans, or whatever you'd like to call those. But you are, in fact, carrying that somehow until the actual construction is completed. Some of the variations of this, and there are myriad. I'm going to try to touch on some of them, but I definitely won't get them all because there's probably a new one being invented as we speak. A private finance initiative. This is typical where the government is trying to leverage private sector finance to supplement, or perhaps even replace in some cases, public sector investment. Very common in India, Pakistan, many of the African countries, where what they're doing is the government contract is leveraged or factored by the private sector partner, right, who has agreed to provide these services, and the cost of providing the service is then borne by the government. So on an ongoing basis, you may be providing the capital to build a hospital or build a jail or something like that. During that phase, you're not being paid, but then you are getting paid for providing the service. Governments may make contributions to public-private partnerships. In some cases, governments can be persuaded to contribute some percentage of the overall capital investment. Some of those are made in cash, they may borrow, etc., or they may provide existing assets, land, right-of-ways, and that sort of thing is very common when you're talking about roads. So public goods projects that are aimed at creating public goods like major infrastructure investments, a hydroelectric dam, a coal generating plant, etc. The government may provide capital subsidies. These capital subsidies come in different forms. They come in terms of one-time grants, at which time, obviously, the risk of cost overruns, etc., and it's as a percentage of the overall investment becomes the private sector's. It is now your problem, right? So if there are cost overruns, the one-time grant's a fixed amount, that's it. There are revenue subsidies or guarantees. In other words, take for instance a toll road where a certain traffic level is projected by the government, and revenues based on tolls that would be projected would be guaranteed. You may have a situation where in Washington State in the United States, there were what they call take-or-pay contracts where the utilities that signed up for generation capacity agreed to either take that electricity at the strike price or pay for it anyway. If their own growth projections did not meet their targets, the fact that you were building the plant was not, you weren't going to be suffered for it. Tax abatements, tax trading, tax advantages of various kinds, tax credits are very common, and sometimes these are tradable. So the corporation that gets them may be able to use them, obviously within the same country because the tax credits would probably not good anyplace else, but they may be tradable to other companies or organizations. And then finally, like revenue subsidies, some sort of guaranteed minimum annual revenues, so that in a case like this, you could obviously take this contract to a bank and say, we have a guaranteed minimum revenue level from the government in a contract. This would function in a very similar way, except that it's obviously guaranteed, to your sales projections. You go to the banks with your sales projections and say, these are expected revenues. We would like to borrow so much money to install new equipment to achieve these production figures. So in most cases, there are the last three. There's some sort of stipulated period of time. In other words, you'll get a tax abatement for some period of time. And what you, of course, want to be sure is that that time period makes sense in your corporate environment. So if you are in a high-tech environment where the equipment in which you're investing is fully depreciated or is obsolete in 5 years, having tax abatements that stretch over 10 is probably not a great idea. Whereas if you're making capital investments that have a 20-year life, getting tax abatements that stretch out over that period, unless there's some reason to front load them, is probably a good idea. Guaranteed annual revenues, similarly, are something that you probably want to project over the life, useful life of the project. Clawback provisions. Clawback provisions are provisions that in essence say that if the corporation does not, if the private partner does not do certain things, complete certain terms, we will take back the tax abatement or the revenue subsidy or the grant money is owed back. And these are very common in areas that are trying to do economic development where they have specifications with respect to their outcomes. So if you're making projections based on that, and those projections are then being part of the provisions that are in your public-private partnership, it's very important to think about what the outcome, what your sensitivity is to those clawback provisions. And the intent of all of these things, of all of these grants, subsidies, tax abatements, etc., is to make the investment more attractive to the private sector. Because remember, we are still talking about public goods and services, which in the general case you would not be doing. So typically a private sector consortium is formed to perhaps you might work together. Let's say we're building a highway. You might have a design firm, a construction firm, consultants, lenders to develop, build, maintain, and or operate this asset over the contract period. So you are also establishing long-term relationships with your private sector partnerships. This is a lot like a marriage, except that there's more than two partners. And you are getting into a long-term relationship, and typically what happens is companies will form a special corporation. In most places they're called a special purpose vehicle. So your company, my company, and a third company of consultants, say KPMG, Construction, and someone else might come together, right, and form an entity in which they own parts of the stock to apply to this public-private partnership, so that the government is then presented with this package of skills, this package of abilities. So it's not just that we can design it, it's not just that we construct it, we can construct, design, operate, maintain the whole thing, and meet the entire need. And in many cases, government has invested in the project, whether it's in kind or anything else. They will also be part of the consortium. So not infrequently, in addition to the private sector consortium, you will find this special purpose vehicle will actually have as one of its members the government entity. And so, for instance, you might have the Turnpike Authority or the Power Generating Authority coming in with you for the purposes of building a given highway or building a given power plant or providing a particular service such as hospital services, education services, etc. I ran into a case just a couple weeks ago in India where they were actually putting together a public-private partnership to bring high technology to schools. So they have the schools, the school system, the Department of Education, they have the hardware company who's going to provide this, and they also have in the organization or in the consortium, the overall consortium, a private sector partner that provides telecom services. So they can provide internet access, the other people provide and maintain, etc., the computers, and there is a 20-year agreement during which the computers are periodically upgraded, etc., during which telecom services evolve, and the public sector partner, the school district, expects, the school districts, the school departments, expects to reap significant benefits, and this is focused in a very small area, a very large area actually, in the rural sectors. where they have the greatest challenges. And so what they've done, in effect, is they have leveraged the expertise, ability, and in some cases the capital of the private sector to deliver computer usage and internet access to rural areas where the government has been unable to make sufficient investments to meet the needs of 21st century education. The special purpose vehicle, this special company, and you all, I'm sure, at this point, have been in partnerships with other companies where the entities are form together a third company to contract with the government and subcontractors to build the facility, maintain it. In the infrastructure sector, we see these very complex arrangements that guarantee and secure cash flows, make the PPP projects prime candidates for project financing, because you now have these financing arrangements which can be factored with either equity or debt in global markets. This makes it very attractive. Project financing brings your financing costs way down and allows you to do things that you might not otherwise be able to do. And the example I use here is a hospital building. This is an actual case, but it's just taking the names out. A hospital building, financing constructed by a private developer, leased back to the hospital authority, which is one of the partners, right? The private developer is then, in essence, the landlord for long term, right? In other words, you don't want a contract on a building that is going to be a hospital for 30 years that's 10 years long, because exactly where are you going to sell a hospital building? So leased back to the hospital authority, the private developers, then the landlord provides housekeeping and all the non-medical services, and the hospital authority provides medical services. And I actually referenced the case that this was taken from. Very interesting process, and again, a way to get health care in especially rural areas that are currently underserved. These product development partnerships, you see software companies, drug companies, and others doing these, but I've also started to see some programmatic development, especially in education, but in rural healthcare also. But here, what happens is they call them product development partnerships, but they're a form of PPP. And what they're trying to do is some type of research, whether it's social research or physical research or anything else, that produces something that the government wants and values. And the example I use is diseases, and there's been, I understand, a public-private partnership that is in the process of developing a vaccine for dengue fever, which I'm personally very interested in because I contracted dengue fever the last time I was in Cambodia, and it was extremely unpleasant. But this kind of thing are relatively new. They were first created in the early 90s, and they have really forged ahead. There are some very tricky intellectual property issues, product development issues, marketing issues that come in here. But if you take a look at some of the cases involved, it's been very, very successful. Some of the critiques of public-private partnerships, the common problem is for investors to obtain a rate of return that's higher than the government bond rate. From the government's perspective, right, that means they've spent too much money, or so it would appear. Most of the risk, the income risk associated with a project borne by the public sector. Obviously, if you are acting in the interest of your stockholders, you want to maximize their profits and reduce the risks. So you want to transfer as much of that as you can. If that's not what you're doing, you're violating your fiduciary responsibility to your stockholders. However, in the public-private partnership arena, the question comes up, And this is something that as you move into this arena, should you choose to do so, you need to be able to deal with. One of the obvious answers to this is, well, yes, it's over the government's rate. However, the government has not been able to do this heretofore, and in the interest of the public, we need to get to this situation. And that was the resolution with respect to the case I mentioned where they are formed a public-private partnership in India to bring computers and internet access to their rural schools. The complaint was raised, well, look, the government can borrow money cheaper than this. Yes, that's true. However, the advantages both in providing this service and in providing long-term upgrades of computers, which change according to Andy Grove every 18 months, and other things were not possible for the government. So the advantages are there. You have to be ready to sell them, ready to talk about that. And then from an economics perspective, the investors got the risk premium on a project that they weren't adequately assuming risk on. However, as I said, the return in my mind is justified in the example I gave by virtue of the fact that the government has not been able to provide computer and internet access to the rural schools, and over time, as these things change very quickly, the contract calls for upgrading, whereas if the computers were government equipment, they would become obsolete and there would be no way to replace them. Another critique is a number of Australian studies of early public-private partnership infrastructure projects concluded that they were inferior to the standard model of production and public procurement based on competitively tendered construction contracts. And in the first place, I think that it was probably true in some of these cases, number one. Number two, one has to realize that costs in Australia are extremely high, and in the general case, and that in the early days of public-private partnership, which this still is, you are running into difficulties as you would expect. All of you have launched new products or services. Right? If any of you actually did it perfectly the first time with no glitches, please call me. I want to get an application to work at your company because obviously you've figured out something no one else has. The patience that's required to develop these things, to learn these new ways, is difficult. And in Australia, a lot of these studies, quite frankly, were motivated by the unions public sector unions who felt that they were being shortchanged in many cases. Similarly, in New Zealand, the Treasury Department released a report that said there's little reliable empirical evidence of the costs and benefits of PPP, and there are other ways of obtaining private sector finance that retain the advantage of PPP, weighed against the contractual complexities and rigidities they entail. I think that there is some validity to this, and we'll deal with some of this in renegotiation. The New Zealand government Treasury report has some problems. Among other things, it's very hard to compare the projects. As any of you who have ever engaged in any kind of construction project know, they are unique. They are unique to the ground, they're unique to the conditions, the weather can change and undermine you. You can be trenching along in what looks like sand and hit sandstone. There are all kinds of difficulties that arise, and I think that I present this critique so that you will be aware of some of the objections that may be raised, not because I think it's something that needs to be denigrate public-private partnerships, which are growing globally. And the reason they're growing, I think, is that we realize now this sort of new name, this public-private community partnership, where the government and the private sector players work together for social welfare. And that's what we're doing here. And understand what this does is harnesses the ability that you have in your corporations to produce social goods. And I think that whether you talk about better education or anything else, well, we are in a situation where corporations are being viewed now as contributors. These are it's just a list of some of the different sorts that you see. One of the most common and big infrastructure projects is the one that I've highlighted, the build, operate, transfer, where over a 20, 30, 40-year lifespan, the private partner is responsible to build, operate, and ultimately transfer the asset to the public partner. Some of the others, again, are different taxonomies, different ways of doing this. I think probably you are better reviewing some of the reference materials so that you can decide in public-private partnerships that you will enter in your context, which are going to be determined, that context is going to be determined by your corporate culture and by the government you're working in. And again, these are just some more of these examples of how to do this. One of the interesting things is some of these efficient risk-sharing ideas, and these turnkey approaches can approximate more of the cash flows of the typical procurement. Again, the turnkey applications, these modified design build, where you essentially provide the government entity with a final product. Performance-based, management-based contracts, maintenance contracts, these are a way of increasing efficiency because you're constrained by the contract in terms of the performance. So if you are supposed to provide visiting nurse services to rural areas, you'll have a threshold, a cost threshold, and a number of visits that you are supposed to provide. And the more efficiently you can do that, the more money you'll make. You will have performance based upon, or payments based upon your performance. And typically these include things like water supply, sanitation, solid waste management, road maintenance. You will provide certain levels of recycling. You reach those levels, you get a certain payment. If you exceed them, you get more payments. Maybe you get to keep the profits from the recycled materials. There are a number of ways of doing this. Some of the other caveats that come out as you start reading World Bank reports, understand that public-private partnerships are not the be-all and end-all. They do not solve all difficulties with respect to underinvestment in public services. They do not wave a wand and create resources that do not exist. The World Bank has a very interesting report on this with respect to Indian infrastructure development, and the reason they focused on India is because India has so wholeheartedly committed. The Prime Minister regularly speaks on the importance of public-private partnership, his government commitment to spending more money in that area. Public-private partnerships represent this claim on the public resource. It needs to be understood, and you need to understand that. You do not want to find yourself in a situation where government change is going to cause you to be considered unavailable or undesirable. And that really revolves around the clear specifications of what you're going to do, how you're going to do it, and how the risks are divided between the. You need to understand that there are some warnings out there. The UN has been particularly vocal on this, and there is this whole idea about whether things should be privatized or at all. And public-private partnerships in the water districts in Brazil, which is what Langicar was writing about, caused extensive price increases because, in many cases, in the final analysis, the private partners and the public partners really did not analyze the situation before they went into it. I cannot stress to you how important it is to analyze the situation and understand what's going on so that you can avoid some of these problems with poorly drafted contracts. Contracts that lack specificity and yet fail to incorporate sufficient flexibility, because over a 60-year life or 20-year life or 30-year life, things are going to change. The contracts have to reflect that. So getting attorneys, and I'm not one of them, getting attorneys who has some experience in that's a good idea. Contract managers are assigned with insufficient resources. Many cases you run into situations where someone who has been in the public sector for their entire career now becomes a contract manager, and they do so without the experience or the training. And a failure to adopt a partnership attitude is very common. If you and or the government partner adopts this them and us idea, you're going to have problems across the board. And that's true if there's clashes of personality in the project team also. This is not any different in many ways than the contracts you've been in, either with government or with other private sector entities in the past. However, the length of these contracts and the closeness of the partnership, the closeness to the bind, is important to realize that this is extremely important. A lot of the problems arise when there's a lack of understanding of the complexity and the context and what things depend on what in the contract. Identification of authority. Who is responsible for what? And how do we measure it? If you do not specify these things up front, you've made a serious error. And if you're not prepared to do that up front, my suggestion is you steer clear of these kinds of arrangements. Focus on existing arrangements rather than the emphasis on potential improvements. One of my critiques of the Australian New Zealand studies and the UN studies is that they focus on things that are rather than things that could develop. One of the things that happens is, and this happens to all of us, I think, to some extent, so we get a contract and we treat it as holy writ. It is not. It is something that can be renegotiated with agreement of partners. And then inadequate management and monitoring of statutory, political, and commercial risk. Commercial risk you're familiar with, but statutory risk and political risk is something we'll talk about in some of the examples if I get there in time. And then signs of inadequate management. If the provider may assume control, leading the unbalanced decisions, may not reflect the interest of the public sector. So make sure you engage these people. Many times government officials are not used to this sort of environment. New business processes may be unsuccessfully integrated into your old ones. Make sure that you're ready to go into public-private partnerships. Make sure that you understand the people within the sector and understand roles and responsibilities and how people deal with these things differently. Remember, when you're negotiating with private sector, with public sector partners, that while you are used to negotiating constantly, it is how you got to where you are. They are not. Their promotions, unlike yours, are not based on those things. Progress may be slow, the desired benefits may not be achieved. These kinds of things are all signs of inadequate management. Contract renegotiations not covered very well. Right? It is something that is not thought about often because the political environment often mitigates against it. In other words, I get a contract in a public-private partnership, all right, it is different than if I get a procurement contract. Let's say that they contract to buy paper from me, all right? Well, if I said, yes, I'm going to provide 20-pound paper and I provide 15, then you have a clear breach of contract, and there's remedies that can be made, and you as an alternative bidder can come in and say, well, wait a minute, I bid 20-pound paper, and if you'd let me build 15-pound paper, then I would have won the contract. Well, in a long-term contract, a public-private partnership contract, things are going to change. Okay? Things are going to change. Let's say you put in a highway with a 20-year term, and then some other agency of the government or something else decides to raise the price of gasoline or to put in an alternative route of high-speed rail or something else. That affects your contract. Right? That affects the contract. The transportation modalities may change. One of the things that they were very careful to do in the recent contract with the Indian schools is to talk about how they deal with the changing of computer needs and evolving as these things move from keyboards to tablets. These things are very important. But in the public sector, often, renegotiation becomes something that is new for the public sector partners for certain. So you, who are going to be more used to them, need to help them along and help them learn. Two contractors, an Indian example, walked away, right, from a project they won because they had a problem with some of the terms because conditions changed. And the airport express project, and this is out of the newspaper in India, they won this. They tried to renegotiate based on some changes in material conditions. But what happened then is some of the unsuccessful bidders came in and said, well, wait a minute, you're changing the rules after the fact, when in fact, that is not what's happening. But they claim that these things are illegitimate. They claim that these renegotiations are illegitimate, right? And that they were, in this case, the World Bank study shows that these concessions awarded 61% of the cases. The concessionaire, the person who won, requested renegotiation. What they don't get to is what kind of things changed, right? So can the bidders who lost the competitive process take the government bodies to court? Can these things change? And the answer is obviously yes. But what happens in the public sector is this issue of moral hazard comes in, where the projects are unviable in the first instance presented as predatory pricing or commercial errors. What's the difference, and how do you tell? And that's an important thing for these people to understand, that these conditions can change. So, a couple of cases real quickly, and then I'll take some questions. Maybe I'll just do one case. They are here. I think you have access to all the slides. But in this case, the traffic estimates and which were tied to the revenue forecast were based on the assumption that industrial incentives given by another branch of government would continue indefinitely, because they did not, the private sector entity did not do sufficient sensitivity testing. When those incentives went away, and you cannot depend on legislative or government authorities to maintain these things forever, then the revenue was lots lower, and the problem comes up that they can't meet the revenue forecast, therefore your financing falls apart, etc. The Delhi Expressway experienced just the opposite problem. They were overwhelmed with traffic. The thing became immensely clogged. Transportation times and this is a problem with a lack of due diligence. Life cycle cost sensitivity analysis should have been done and was not. The Hyderabad Metro, the winning bid was wildly better than anybody else's submission. And I will tell you, if you haven't learned this in business, then I don't know where you've been. but if something looks too good to be true, it probably is. If someone comes to you and says, I have a no-risk investment, we're going to make 100% return, I would look at their tea leaves. People went through this and did not think about it being too good to be true. In this case, the port case, things were extremely skewed. The government's criteria for evaluating this. So when you're looking at or considering a public-private partnership, look at the government's criteria. All right, the government's criteria in this case favored large commitments even though they were unrealistic. So of course someone gave them these large commitments, and now they're going to have to go through the entire process all over again. Here, in this case, the container terminal, the highest royalty payment was the only criteria in effect. Well, it's insufficient because they lacked a method to assess royalty payouts, and they didn't cover all the issues necessary to determine what is indeed a royalty and what's the cost. Mumbai Metro, again, land acquisition. The government committed to make the land acquisition and didn't do it. Long story short, it took a great deal of time. As you know, if you make a commitment of your resources to one thing, all right, you wind up with all the subcontractors and everybody else lined up, they're going to go to somebody else. It's going to cost you a great deal of money. Again, the land acquisition was a critical path here, and in my view, the private sector should have made sure that the government had land in hand before they went on with this. This is the expressway case where the other happened. The many agencies required to approve it. It delayed the construction. These delays are expensive in construction, and similar problems were experienced in the water supply. So the experience here is the best approach is to get them all into a single room and hammer out the problems in batches. Get these people committed to solving these problems. Don't allow the control to slip from your grasp. Well-defined scope of work. This highway case was one where at the last minute the highway authority changes to initial designs, right, days before the project was supposed to be completed. Absolutely impossible to do. How do you deal with this? Well, obviously they need to renegotiate the contracts. But the government, you need to be sure that the government is committed to the scope of work and the scope of the project. This container terminal case, they lacked regarding the royalty payment. I think I talked about that one already. Anyway, those are the references. They're all can be made available in a Dropbox format so that you can get them, pick and choose easily. You can contact any one of us, or I assume you can contact the Madinah Institute to acquire those. We're happy to provide them. I'm sure the Institute will be able to provide them too. If I have any more time, if I haven't abused your concentration, I'd be happy to take questions.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Kittredge. Folks, we are open for the Q&A, so if you have questions, you could either raise your hand or you could put them in the chat box, and I'll be happy to read them over. I already see there's a hand raised, so let me go directly and see if we can unmute.
Okay.
Mr. Brother Weil Monairi, you've raised your hand, sir. Could you please introduce yourself and ask the question? Brother Weil, Mr. Weil Monairi. Hello? Hello?
Hello?
Yes, Mr. Monairi, you raised your hand. Do you have a question? Hello?
Hello?
I think let me move to the chat box. Try to mute him again. Somehow, okay. Okay, sir, there are questions in the box already. Short ones, let me go to them one by one. Dr. Kittredge, how stock options rolled out during public-private partnership programs? Hello, Dr. Kittredge? You there? Hello?